Hello, everyone. My name is Ella Bekeshi. I am a co-founder and co-director at Heritage Education Network Belize. And many of you may not know, but I also worked at Lamanai Archaeological Reserve and at the nearby Indian Church Village for many years. And I'm currently one of the leads on our World Monuments Fund 2022 watch nomination of Lamanai Archaeological Reserve and its broader cultural landscape. So in 2017, I did ethnographic research at Indian Church Village, looking at the relationship between Lamanai and the local residents. Although I have spent a lot of time in the village before, and since then, it was very interesting and eye-opening to converse with the people and listen to their stories. Now, while there are many angles I could take, there are three key topics I'd like to focus on today, and these are identity, placemaking, and the role of heritage tourism. Now, the importance of these angles is to help us understand what are some of the ongoing socioeconomic, tourism, and heritage challenges, and what methods are best to tackle these in the case of Lamanai. Similar challenges are actually present at many heritage sites across the globe. It is part of our discipline. And so I look at this study as an opportunity for continuous learning and improvement. And before we get into it, I wanted to share some background information about Lamanai and Indian Church Village. I will be brief since Lamanai is the topic of an entire session at the KULCHA Symposium. Many of you already know a great deal. So Lamanai and Archaeological Reserve is located in the Orange Walk district along the New River Lagoon. Lamanai and the larger archaeological area includes Lamanai Reserve itself, Kaka Beach, which is 10 kilometers to the west from Lamanai, and other sites such as Koko Chan, for example. Now, the Lamanai cultural area, on the other hand, is much bigger and more ambiguous, if I can say that. It includes various villages like San Carlos, San Felipe that are close to Lamanai, Mennonite camps and communities such as Shipyard or Blue Creek. And one can argue about other villages being part of the cultural area like August Pine Ridge, Yoke Creek, all the way to Orange Walk Town, essentially. And then there is Indian Church Village, which is located a mile south of the core of Lamanai Archaeological Reserve, sharing a border with the reserve currently. And it used to be located inside what we call Lamanai Archaeological Reserve today, near to 16th century Spanish colonial churches, roughly where you see the red circle on the map. And the village was moved in 1990 to make space for conservation, park development, and to accommodate growing tourism. Now, in addition to the traditional, quote unquote, traditional Maya history at the site that we often see highlighted, Lamanai also has an interesting colonial history that is partly shown by the two 16th century Spanish Franciscan churches close to the location of Old Indian Church Village, like I showed you in the previous slide. Now, these churches can tell the story of Maya resistance in the area during the early colonial periods in Belize, for example. And you can also see a beautiful illustration by Louise Bélanger on the right about how one of the churches looked like. Now, then we can talk about the 19th century British sugar mill on site, which tells the story of Chinese or East Indian indentured laborers being brought to Belize, as well as the history of the sugar industry in Orange Walk, which is one of the main industries till this day. I am being brief here with the history because of time, but as you can see, while the most popular tourism attractions usually include the Maya site core at Lamanai, it actually represents much more in terms of what Belize and Belizean society is today. So I conducted an ethnographic research between May and August in 2017 in Indian Church Village and Lamanai Archaeological Reserve. And while it has been 5 years, I do feel that the results are still really relevant, especially in light of the 2022 World Monuments Watch nomination. So I want to mention some of my research methods that I followed. I primarily adopted a so-called qualitative approach. I used semi-structured, open-ended interview questions and observational methods. I conducted one-on-one interviews between June and July in 2017, and I also asked the residents to fill out a short questionnaire in addition. I randomly selected 37 residents, ages 18 or above. All interviews were anonymous, and each participant was given a code which they are referred by. And interviews were conducted in English or Spanish, depending on what the individual wanted. And I interviewed approximately 16.6% of the interview eligible population of Indian Church, meaning 18 years or above. And I was looking to understand village history and relationships within the village and Lamanai as well. And I also wanted to understand tourism behavior in the village. So how many and what kind of tourists visit the area? Overnight, school trips, cruise tourism, etc. How often do residents visit? Do they visit differently from other tourists? How do they cope with rules and regulations that heritage sites usually have? And finally, how do these factors impact the safeguarding of culture, economic development, and well-being at Indian Church Village? So my observational work included Lamanai Outpost Lodge and the site of Lamanai itself, restaurants at Indian Church Village, 2 guest houses, souvenir shops at the site of Lamanai itself, and of course, Indian Church Village as a whole. The main themes focused on, like I mentioned, place identity, placemaking, which includes representation and local narratives, and tourism involvement. And I want to say here that if there are people from Indian Church Village listening, I hope I do you justice with what I will talk about. And firstly, I want to talk a little bit about identity and placemaking. 2 things to highlight here. The majority of the people in Indian Church Village have ties with Guatemala or El Salvador, but many people were already born in Indian Church, either on the old village or in the new village, and I mean literally on site, because that is where the old village was. And also when I asked about descendencia, heritage, patrimonio, out of 25 people who answered, 24 highlighted to have some level of Maya descent. So though the connection to Lamanai, what I noticed is actually only partly came from shared Maya identity and mainly from being Belizean citizens. People take on a more shared global heritage approach, and when asked questions like whose heritage is Lamanai, who should it belong to, who treasures it the most, people overwhelmingly said that Lamanai belongs to everybody, or it belongs to Belizeans and the country of Belize. So that's an interesting approach. I also want to talk about childhood memories. They're very important. I heard many stories, and people showed me, trees their grandparents planted, for example. And I want to read these 2 quotes because I feel they represent how people in Indian Church Village look at Lamanai and how this connection is shared through generations. So the first one is, Because when I was a little girl, I used to go because, you know, we lived there and we used to have a little dock where my mom, she used to go to wash, and she was washing and we were swimming. But it was when we were kids, and I love it. I swim, but I can't swim a lot now. And then there's also a younger resident who said, because I know a lot of stories that my mom told me because they used to live there before, and it sounds just good, and I feel like it's part of me. So overall, people from Indian Church Village look at the site of Lamanai as a social space first, and as a tourist attraction second. People call the site home, and it actually represents their identity as Belizeans, their connection to Belize, and to the Indian church community. And people use the site differently as well. They tell stories, they have picnics, and would want to visit the places where their parents or grandparents lived, see those trees that their grandparents planted. So it's a very different kind of approach to the site that you would normally see. Now, how can we, what we need to think about is how can we accommodate these non-touristy visits, essentially? How can we represent the stories of the people, and not just Indian Church Village residents, but the residents of surrounding villages, Maya communities in surrounding villages, some of whom have actually presented at KULCHA this week, And then going into tourism involvement, I want to talk a little bit more about that. I looked at the 2019 pre-COVID data. I didn't want to use 2020 statistics because it would give COVID numbers, and I think that the 2021 statistics are not available yet, or at least I couldn't find them. However, what is interesting when we look at the 2019 stats is, one, over 89.8% of visitors at Lamanai were international tourists. And out of 74,444 visits, only 4,665 were Belizean residents in total. Now, we don't know how much of this are Indian church residents or people from local villages. Two, Indian Church Village saw possibly less than 100 visitors in 2019. We would have to check field school and research visits and the visitation of Lamanai Outpost Lodge specifically, but it is relatively isolated from the village anyway. So I do know that during and after COVID, this tendency somewhat shifted and more Belizean residents visit sites now. We will have to see the statistics about that. Still, what we can see in this case is an extreme case of unbalanced tourism, a level of over-tourism at Lamanai that negatively impacts conservation, and low tourism at Indian Church that also negatively impacts the economy of the village and the surrounding villages. So Indian Church is actually not often included in guided tours or in tourism publications, and many tourists enter Lamanai via the lagoon, avoiding the village. That was one of the main issues that was highlighted. Interestingly, still, when I asked, 91.9% of people stated that Lamanai has either a smaller or larger economic impact on Indian Church Village, and they primarily mentioned tourism-related jobs, and archaeological projects. And 73% would want to be more involved with what is happening at Lamanai still, even though there is some economic impact that people are already seeing. So coming to an end, I just wanted to highlight some ideas. How can we use this information? We can look at planning community engagement projects and enabling mutual learning opportunities to learn from each other. We can, we can look into changing museum exhibits or tours to include local narratives and local sites. We can, look at analyzing involvement in tourism and going on that path. We can also look at potentially enabling new ways of information sharing, allowing people to tell their stories and making those stories public if people wish to, making those stories accessible. We can look at capacity building trainings as well. And it is important to see, in my opinion, how the case of Lamanai and Indian Church Village can be used to approach similar challenges, not just in the district and not just in Belize, but worldwide as well. I hope I've said something new, and thank you for your time, and hope you enjoyed the presentation.